I figured that given the fact that I have a sense of who several of you are, I would talk a little bit about myself and then a little bit about a few organizations that I have been involved in and been fortunate and privileged to participate in. I have had the extraordinary privilege and opportunity to be a witness to a lot of history. I suppose a lot of history is a relative term, but I was fortunate enough to meet Dr. Martin Luther King when I was young. I was fortunate enough to meet people like Thurgood Marshall and Jack Greenberg, who headed the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, and I was fortunate enough to be in the Soviet Union on the day that they lowered the flag of the Soviet Union and raised the flag of the Russian Federation. I was fortunate enough to be in Germany when the wall fell, and I was fortunate enough to be in South Africa, working in South Africa after Nelson Mandela was released, but before the ANC came into power, and working on unbundling. That's the process of facilitating the acquisition of assets by Black South Africans who are returning from Hong Kong, New York, and London mostly, to South Africa to participate in the new economy. I was fortunate enough to work in the Russian Federation during the time of Yeltsin when they were creating the new Russian Federation. I was in Tajikistan when the Taliban took it over. So I've had an opportunity to see a lot of interesting and dynamic change in the world and to contribute in a very small way to a lot of it. This is only possible, in my perspective, because of the history that I come from in the United States. My family has a long history in civil rights in America. My grandfather was a colleague of a fellow named Charles Hamilton Houston, who was one of the intellectual giants of the civil rights movement. And many of you have heard of the case Brown versus Board of Education, but what you may not understand was that Brown versus Board of Education, which was the case that determined that separate but equal was not acceptable law under the Constitution of the United States, was part of an aggressive and coherent strategy that said, intellectually and legally, if the states are going to take the position that the law will be separate but equal, we will force them to provide equal facility, which will force the states to go bankrupt. And so what they did was they decided to bring actions against the most expensive graduate schools in the United States, and then against the most expensive colleges that discriminated in the United States, and then to force them to duplicate public school systems for black people in the United States that would provide equal educational opportunity. Knowing full well that the states could not afford to do this duplication, they would have no choice but to accede to equal education, to integrated schools on all levels. And that was a long series of steps and legal strategy to force that change. Now, one of the things that has been clear to me since I came to the UK 18 years ago is that there's a very different dynamic in relationship to people of color in the UK. Part of my exposure to this is a result of the efforts of Connie Jackson, who's here today. But many years ago, she and a group of black women came to me and said, our children are being harassed by the police department in the UK, in London. And we don't have the sort of political clout that you have in America. Now, we'll set aside that perception for a second. And because, as you well know, the circumstances in the United States in relationship to dealing with the police, the challenges are still evident. But what was not evident then was the political clout. And the reason the political clout didn't exist in England that existed in the United States was because in England the communities of color were actually very disparate. The Nigerians didn't talk to the Ghanaians didn't talk to the Trinidadians didn't talk to the Jamaicans, and so when you spoke with people of color, they would say, I'm Trinidadian, as opposed to I am Black English, or I am Black British. The difference being, of course, in the United States, we lost all of that ability because through years of slavery and loss of our historical ethnic identities, and the law, very significantly the law, people were classified as black. And it didn't matter if you were Trinidadian or Jamaican or if you were mulatto, you were classified as black. And so you were forced to live in segregated black communities in many parts of the United States. And even in many parts of the North, for a variety of reasons, you also ended up in segregated black communities. And so in the United States, a culture of Black America grew that didn't have the opportunity to grow here in the UK in the same way. And as a result, you didn't have the coalescing of all of the various people that you had in the United States. That means you didn't have the same strength of community. It also meant you didn't have the same strength of professional organizations. The American Bar Association, which I was a member of for many years and once ran for president of and didn't win, but I was on the board of governors and have a very strong reputation and discriminated against people of color until 1947 officially, and continued to discriminate well into the 1960s. And it wasn't until President Kennedy decided in 1963 that he needed the bar to step forward to support the civil rights movement that the American Bar Association began to change. And as a result, the American Bar Association has changed tremendously. But because of that history, in virtually every major professional organization in America, you have a Black Association of Journalists, a Black Association of Physicians, the National Medical Association, the National Bar Association, which is a Black Association of Lawyers, and stockbrokers, bankers, you name it. There is a parallel organization in the Black community and in most other communities, in the Hispanic community, in the Asian American community, which goes back hundreds of years. And as a result, very strong organizations with very strong traditions and very strong histories. Along those organizations are sororities and fraternities, which were organizations that attracted the educated communities. They started in college in many cases, but what they would do is they would pick historically the best and the brightest, and that is where the strategy and the person power came from to facilitate the civil rights movement. It's the students who created SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It is the fraternities and sororities who supported the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization that Martin Luther King was affiliated. And it is all of these organizations, along with organizations like the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund, who funded all of the legal challenges. That's how I got to meet these people when I was a kid. They would come to Wisconsin to raise money, and my family was active in that exercise. So there are these long traditions of activism in organizations that by design were created in a segregated community. But what that did was it focused the intellectual power of the community in a way that when the community spoke, people had to listen. And the outgrowth of the work that I did with Connie and the women several years ago initially was to create an organization called Center for African Progress, which was designed to be a diaspora organization cross-continent that would address a variety of different issues, like, for example, education, women's rights, human rights, political governance, corporate governance, health, maybe 8 or 9 key issues that were critical to the discussion in virtually all communities of color around the world. And we were going to set up a virtual think tank that would tap into every major African country, the United States, certainly most of the European countries, but basically anywhere there were people of color who had to add to the conversation. The goal was to pull down all the PhDs that people had written, but nobody reads because they sit on shelves in libraries, and make that information available to the community so that we could have a stronger influence on policy and governments and politics and lobbying and all these types of things. Anyway, we were working on this right as the recession hit, the Great Recession as it's now known, and so the funding didn't come together to make that as successful as we wanted to. It's still out there. We have wonderful architecture for the website and the base. And in fact, the people who designed it are now doing their PhDs, so there's real opportunity there too. But a few years later, I was asked to create an organization here in London, which is a branch of one of those organizations in the United States. And we have pulled that together. And the goal is to develop a new paradigm for a black organization in the UK. And not just black. I mean, first of all, the question of how one defines black is a very peculiar one. And I say it's peculiar not just because race is a scientific non-entity, but because in the United States, black was defined by law. If you were in one state, if you had one drop of black blood, you were defined as black. If in another state, if you had, 1/16th Negro blood, then you were defined as black. The point is, the definitions didn't make any sense, but the ramifications of the policies had a very severe impact on the people in the black community in the United States. The point of all of that is when we started pulling together our group, if we found someone who was Indian, who was born in Kenya, we found that they really had the same interests as a black person from Kenya who was living in the UK. We found that the Pakistanis had just as much a problem with the police as the Nigerians did in the UK. We found that there were people from Singapore who were just as dark. They weren't sitting on boards of directors here in the UK either. And so we had to reconceive our definition of who were the people of interest that we were trying to serve. And we decided not to waste a lot of time defining people out of the organization. Most of the organizations in the United States that are historically black organizations have not and never have been historically exclusive. People like Jack Greenberg, who was a great Jewish lawyer who headed the LDF, was a member of several black organizations in the United States as somebody who dedicated his life to the commitment of the freedom or the tearing down of the laws of black people. So anyway, we created the organization here. We expanded it. We pulled together many of the leading black professionals and black business people and black bankers and black hedge fund people here in the UK. And we had a very nice event with a group called the Executive Leadership Council. The Executive Leadership Council is a group of Fortune 500 executives, most of whom are black, C-suite executives from around the United States. They recognized that they needed to go international, because if you want to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company today, you need to have international experience. And we hosted a wonderful event here in London that included a reception at St. James Palace, a program at the Institute of Directors addressing issues of diversity as it relates to multinational directorships, a wonderful lunch hosted at the House of Lords by Lord Michael Hastings, and some other nice things, including a gala event. Now there is the possibility of a concept of doing a much larger event, something akin to the London Economic Forum. And the goal is to, if Davos reaches one-tenth of the top 1%, we'll go a little bit lower. We'll search for a 1%, but we'll also search for a diverse group of people of great intellect, of creativity, of differing perspective. And so if we can generate a series of programs and issues and interactions of people who are, say, I don't know, 40% of color in the leaders in their fields, then we will create a new dynamic and a different type of conversation than has ever happened, I think, before. And so those are some of the things that we're working on. It's exciting, and it facilitates change. I didn't explain that much that there's a long history of change that I have had the opportunity to see. In addition to that I personally experienced going back to my grandfather and my grandmother and her sisters and my mother, my father, and others. It is wonderful to see change happen, and it is great to participate in the process. It creates opportunity for us, for our children, for our children's children, for our community's children. It makes us stronger as a people. And someone had mentioned there was a time when the vice chairman of General Electric was African American. And Jack Welch came to him and suggested that they needed to set up affinity organizations. I know that there are a lot of people in England who don't understand why affinity organizations are beneficial, but he suggested that this individual, this vice chairman, needed to set up an affinity organization. And he was resistant. He said, well, why should I do that? And Jack Welch said, why do you think there's so many Irish officers of this company? If you don't do this, nobody else will. And so it has been my experience that there is an extraordinary amount of talent in London, and I also know that there's an extraordinary amount of talent in Africa. What I didn't realize was that many of the great leaders in London didn't know each other and didn't know each other were black. And I said, for example, to one managing partner of an American law firm, who do you pick up the phone and call when you say, can you believe what they just did to me? You know, if you don't know each other, if you don't provide each other strength, network within a community, then it will only cause pain and grief and hinder your own success. You have to have the ability to support each other. And through the supportive organization, through a network of leaders and dynamic people, it is my sincere hope that we will be able to learn from each other and learn from each other's painful experiences. And as a result, it is my expectation that we will be able to leave a stronger legacy than we would on our own. We are a dynamic community, and we have the ability to do great things, and together we can do greater things. And to the extent that I can, it's my hope to help facilitate that. Thank you.